All right, seed talk, stuff to make your seeds walk. You might have some intro music to explain that whole thing. You know, Bobby's the one who started the actual visual of this. I thought it was really cute. When I shoot the music video, I'm coming down to Arizona. I'm gonna capture time while you're here, and we were recording to be in the video going like this.
Got to.
But let's get into it, man. It's seed talk. Like I said, stuff to make your seeds walk. We got Bobby here, and I like to do a lot of these individual one-on-ones because Bobby, he knows the law, and he can tell us, what's going on from a legal perspective. And what's on the docket today is affirmative action. And I know we're gonna get a lot of comments with this, and I'm gonna really challenge Bobby on this one, man, and on affirmative action and what's going on, because I want to get into it, man. I want to know. I want to ask Bobby really what are the pros and cons, because a lot of people from our community think there's nothing but pros from it, and I want to know if there's any cons. And I'm gonna go ahead, full disclosure, you know what I'm saying, and be transparent. I am a quote unquote affirmative action baby. I am. I am. I went to the University of Washington, and that was one of the determining factors that allowed me into that institution. Now, I will say this: if we're doing full transparency, I did go on to get my degree, and I went on to what I would like to say are the equivalent of two masters. I got a master's. Well, I got my degree in English lit, but then I also got a master's in teaching. But I also got a certificate in educational leadership, which is to me is an equivalent of a master's to be a principal. My auntie would disagree with me. She's a former superintendent and principal. Like, Elijah, that's not a master's. I'm like, I'm the equivalent. I put the time in. The same amount of time I put in to be a principal was the same amount of time that I put in to get my master's in teaching. Mind your business, auntie. And I think, and I'm gonna let Bobby speak for himself. What I want us to do when we start this conversation is I want you to talk about what just happened legally, who was involved in it. I want you to talk about Clarence Thomas. Yes, I am. I am giving you some prompts. Okay, I'm lobbing them up there, and what that means in our community, what it means between Democrats and Republicans and conservatives and liberals. But I also want you to talk about what is your personal relationship with affirmative action and how it impacts our community. Yeah. So go ahead.
So I think I'll start with the personal part.
Go ahead.
I'll start with the personal part just because it's easiest to work from there. And I'll say that people in the state of Washington are aware of Initiative 200 or I-200. I-200 did what the Supreme Court just executed with reversing or barring, prohibiting affirmative action, I think almost 20 years ago in the state of Washington. And ever since then, proponents of affirmative action have been trying to essentially reinstall it. And the reason why people feel so strongly about it is that it has dramatic impacts on outcomes in certain types of institutions. And so, for example, when I was admitted to the Evans School of Governance at the University of Washington, which is a master's program at the time, it was ranked number 3 in the world behind, I want to say, like Harvard, who has the Kennedy School of Government, which will always be number 1, and probably Princeton. So it was like the number 3 public admin program in the world at the time. And I was one of 2 self-identifying African-American males in a class of 300 total that were admitted. And I was not an affirmative action admit because the University of Washington did not practice it at the time. And as a result of that, as far as what it took to be admitted into that program, I finished number 1 or most outstanding graduating student at my undergraduate university. So for me to be admitted as an African American at that institution, competing against my peers who or what logic would call melanin deficient, and people from China who pay double tuition, and other folks that have a easier route. It took me being 3.77 cumulative GPA in undergrad, multiple sports, student athlete, and being the most outstanding graduating student. And apparently, nobody else who looked like me had a resume like that, or one other person did. And we were the only two that were admitted. Similarly, the law school had a class of 1 or 2 out of 300 at the same time. So when we take away affirmative action from these institutions as a thing that they can consider, or race as a thing that they consider in admissions, they often move to what they consider to be a straight meritocracy. I'm going to tell them to be quiet.
Yeah. Please. We're moving around. And what Bobby's saying is that he's over here, he's swag surfing on us real quick, man. He's over here popping his collar. He's flexing. Hey, man, basically what Bobby's saying is I didn't need affirmative action, fool. If you don't stop flexing on us, Bobby.
No, but what I was really saying was that it's the exception that a student from our community will be admitted when we go to a model for admission that is about comparing resumes. And the reason why I was able to be the exception is because I had so much privilege in my life prior to those moments. But not everybody in our community comes from two-parent home. Hell, not everybody in our community has a white mother who had a job in corporate America, who could supplement my private education for me, who could send me to the camps, who could do all the things that built my resume. Like when I was in high school, I went to people.
You grew up in Seattle.
Yeah. But, I went to People to People Leadership Academy at Stanford University when I was in high school. That cost money, even though you're invited to it. And those are the things that students from these other private high schools across the land do. And you're competing against them, and you went to a public school and you didn't have two working parents. If we do a straight meritocracy model, it becomes difficult to compete with students who come from resources. And so then when you look at class, the question becomes how many Black Americans come from those situations? And
but if we're looking at a meritocracy, then the meritocracy is often, if not always, based on access to opportunity.
Absolutely.
To obtain that merit. So it's not a true meritocracy if not everyone has access to those opportunities to obtain that merit.
Yeah, correct. And that is the reason why so many people are offended by what our court has decided. And so we can jump into that now.
Nice segue. That was nice.
So what we're looking at is the Supreme Court and our courts generally make decisions based on precedent or existing law or existing circumstances. In this country, we have had cases over the last 30 or 40 years that deal with not only integrating schools, but deal with the idea of how we integrate schools, and particularly institutions that have admissions processes. And one thing that has come out is that race could be considered. There was a time where race could be what the court considered to be a dispositive factor. But as soon as the court learned that there were institutions that were using race as a dispositive factor, and what we're talking about is essentially admitting a student because they're Black, and that was out of a quota system, there became a number of challenges from people like Johnny and Timmy, etc., who were not being admitted to these institutions because there was a spot that was for somebody else. And so what was born out of that litigation was the concept of race as a factor that is not dispositive. And for those who don't know what dispositive, it means that it is the deciding factor. So race cannot be the deciding factor, but it can be a factor in an admission process. And that stood for some time. And the court And Grutter, which is the name of the case for those who are interested in doing this research, and Bakke, Bakke, two cases, and I believe that's the University of Texas and the University of Michigan, at one point had affirmed that universities could use race as a factor so long as it was not the determining factor, because there is an interest in diversity in higher education. And that was important because that goes to colleges, not high schools, even though our conversation historically was about busing in high schools and integrating, and that was the reason that that language was very specific. So that interest, though, that interest in diversifying the schools moving forward in time from the Grutter and Bakke decisions then became, how do we do that? And so recently, a group of Chinese students at Harvard University sued the university because they were not admitted, and they knew that Harvard utilized race as a factor, but they also knew that Harvard had legacy students and student athletes. And a number of different students, I guess, who you could say were outside of what we would call traditional merit-based admission. And essentially, what these students were saying is that if we looked at our metrics, our individual profiles, our test scores, our GPA, then we should be admitted, as opposed to that individual over there who is playing basketball, that individual over there who's a legacy student, or that individual over there who we feel like was admitted because of race. And this is not a unique claim, right? Over the last 30 years, we've seen this at a number of institutions. But Harvard, obviously, is going to get the attention. The same thing happened at University of North Carolina. I'm not aware of who the plaintiffs were in that lawsuit, as opposed to Harvard, where we know exactly who it was. I don't know who the plaintiffs were in that case. But both universities, both Harvard and North Carolina, admitted that they did use race as a factor in their admissions. And so here, what we're seeing is in the Texas case and in the Texas and Michigan cases, the court affirmed that, but the court has changed, and the court has become more conservative with the appointment of justices from the Trump administration. And it's also worth noting that the Trump administration was heavily invested in the idea of investigating reverse racism, as opposed to what previous presidential cabinets had done, like focusing on instances of racial hate, etc. They were focused on reverse racism. And you can see how this plays out, because this court has decided that using race as a factor, even though they did not explicitly say it in the opinion, they basically overruled the decisions that allowed the University of Texas and the University of Michigan to use race. So what we have is a weird scenario, and it comes up in Clarence Thomas, who wrote an opinion here with the winning party of the court, so to speak, who said that for all intensive purposes, using race in admissions is overturned. Even though the court, in its official opinion, did not say that, Thomas wrote an opinion in support of the winning side and said, for all intensive purposes, using race in admission is overruled. And that's significant for Thomas in particular, because a lot of this litigation comes out of language from Thomas historically, where he said any mention or consideration of race is racist. And that language from Thomas has become weaponized by conservatives for a long time. But now that the court is more conservative, we're seeing that language become the language of the United States when we talk about affirmative action.
Yeah, I appreciate you explaining that and teaching us on, the legal aspects of that. And me as an educator, I'm gonna take it back to to stats and data, because that's a big part of my job. Mm-hmm. And I say it often. There's two ways someone can lie to you, and that's to your face and with numbers and stats. And when anyone presents stats to you, I I encourage you to ask follow-up questions because stats are what you want them to be. Stats are only as good as the questions that are posed to them. So I don't know keeping that in mind, I don't know any data out there that says that when we look at the data and stats, that high test scores actually equate to good, active, and informed citizens and healthy citizens, you know what I'm saying, in our society and in our nation. I don't know. I think we lost you. You went black, man. This is a black movie now. Bobby, I'm gonna have to write you a citation for production violations here. But I don't know any data or stats that says because a person scores high on their SATs, has a high IQ, and goes to one of these affluent universities, that they come out of that whole system and that institution based on test scores and their admission criteria in that degree, good, healthy human beings that value the lives of other human beings. I would actually argue it's the complete opposite. Is that when you focus and hyper magnify on a person's test scores and their academic achievement, that you usually get people who look at other human beings as just that, numbers to be crunched, and don't have those soft skills, you know what I'm saying, to really push the needle to change the conditions that actually change the actions and behaviors of people so we can have a society that meets the needs of everybody. And that is what I brought to the table at the University of Washington, that they took into high consideration, apparently. And I got admitted, even though my test scores, you know what I'm saying, didn't meet the criteria. But I brought, you know what I'm saying, you got to write that struggle letter. You got to write that letter of intent. You got to write in there, and I purposely left out, and I don't talk about this a lot. I purposely left out that my father went to prison when I was 5 years old because I didn't want to get in, according to that origin story. I wanted to get in that I bring to your campus leadership. I was in this organization. I was the president of the African American Club. I played sports. I'm a leader. That's what I'm bringing to your campus. You know what I'm saying? And I think I put in there, of course, that I've overcome racism and blah, 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 blah. You know what I'm saying? I'm a transplant from the Midwest, blah, 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 blah. But I purposely left out, some things because I didn't want to be a part of the stereotype. But I went on to, my point is I went on, to add to that, the tapestry and mode of that campus while I was there. I see myself as a healthy human being, you know what I'm saying? And I actually was there with the intent to challenge other human beings who were there who had higher test scores. I was challenging them to be more healthy. That's what I was doing when I was, saying, leading protests and, being in opposition of, white supremacy and racism and stuff as the parliamentarian of the Black Student Union and the vice president of campus affairs, which is the equivalent of a vice president of any, organization. And I know we have similar origin stories. We both went to O'Day. We both were a part of, the administrative or leadership body of, the Black Student Union there on campus. And we both grew up in Seattle. So we have some adjacent stories and some parallel and a lot of, intersection when it comes to our privilege, but we chose to use our skills differently. I mean, you were definitely academically, according to numbers, you're definitely 3.7. I couldn't count that high. I think I graduated from high school, with 2.7.
But I was only a 3.0 student in high school. I didn't care about it. And then
me either.
When I got But what radicalized me in academics was being on campuses with people who accused me of being an affirmative action admit. And then I said, I will beat all of you. And then I did. But
Yeah,
it mattered to me
yeah,
that I proved to people around me that I wasn't the handout. But while I was at the University of Washington getting my master's degree, the Young Republicans held a bake sale next to
they
me
did
where
the
they
same thing
sold
when I was
cookies,
there. That is such
basically.
a trope, bro. In that group, they did the same
The
thing.
brown cookies were 25 cents, and they said, this is how easy it is to get in for students of this color. And they had the white cookie there for like $6. The sugar cookie was $6. But it was that attitude from other people there that radicalized me and said, no, you guys are all going to watch me speak at graduation. And and I did. But that's what it was about. Because I didn't like that there was this implicit comment that was coming from people that I didn't deserve to be there and that they did. And it was inflammatory because when I was sitting before the board of regents at the University of Washington in 2014 as the Black Student Union president, I just asked them to explain to me why there was an issue with preferential treatment based on soft skills. Getting applications that talk about joining the Black Student Union as opposed to scoring well on uh, standardized exams when we already know empirically that the standardized exams benefit certain people. And I was saying, if you're not willing to concede that using the tests as an overwhelming and is an overwhelming factor in admission is also specialized treatment for our Asian American and white American students, then I don't want to hear about specialized treatment with respect to athletics and social clubs and extracurriculars. I just don't. It's the same thing. And so what it turns out to be, and you could see it in the Harvard litigation, when the plaintiff, so the Chinese American students, were asking about potentially removing any special admissions process for student athletes, it becomes a question of who do you think you deserve to be there more than? It's very hard for me not to see it that way. And I want to be careful because I don't have any special vitriol for this group of Chinese American students. I'm not upset with them. They're doing what they think is best for them in this moment. I think that they're participating in the poverty Olympics as far as when we talk about the racial hierarchy and competing directly against each other. But I understand why they're doing it. So I'm not upset about that. I don't want anyone to use this podcast to have an excuse to hate Asian people or Chinese Americans, because that shit is whack. So that's just not okay. But what's happening is that they've learned from the Kate Smiths. And when I say Kate Smith, I believe that was like the name from the University of Washington lawsuit in the early 2000s that changed the statistics at the law school from being over 30% minority to less than 5% African American after that lawsuit, because Kate Smith sued University of Washington because someone else got admitted and she had a better test score than them.
Right.
And this has been the playbook for the last 30 years, but we haven't had a court that has given it any, that has paid it any mind until now.
Yeah, but as a debate coach and a person, I used to get busy on the University of Washington campus, and I devoted a lot of my time to debunking affirmative action arguments from, what I'm saying, anti-affirmative action arguments. Um, and I'm not even gonna lie. Point of transparency again. It was because I had a little bit of internalized shame and embarrassment of being an affirmative action baby. And I wanted to show them on an intellectual level, it don't really matter about how I got here. I'm here.
Mm-hmm.
And what really matters is how long can I stay here and can I follow through and get this degree like other people who have gotten here based on other criteria. And I
But
can. And I proved that.
I hate to
several
cut you
times.
off. I hate to cut you off, but this has to be mentioned.
What's that?
One of the hardest or most difficult things to acknowledge, particularly with the University of Washington, is that when after Larry Gossett and Emil and all those boys stayed in President Odegaard's office,
Right.
made demands to admit 300 more black students, the yield on those students was incredibly low as far as graduation.
Yeah, because they didn't have the support though, too.
Exactly. So that's the thing that people will bring up. And then that's me throwing the lob for you, because it's not enough to just create an opportunity to allow people to be there. You also have to have the mechanisms to support those people, because if you're coming out of underfunded public schools into these institutions, you're not set up to be successful. And that's the reason why the Office of Minority Affairs and the Instructional Center and all the things that came up at University of Washington exist, because that yield was so low on that first class of people that they let in. And I use the words let in because that's how people describe it. They're like, well, we opened the floodgates for these people that didn't deserve to be here.
Well,
And
you let in a whole bunch of people. See, the Kate Smith argument was always trash to me. And the reason why Kate Smith argument is trash to me is because why are you hyper focusing on this mythical, or even if you do have an actually real black person that got admitted, and you didn't, why are you choosing that person? Why are you choosing? Because you know why? Because there was probably a lot of white folks that got admitted that had, you know what I'm saying, that, you know, had lower test scores than you too, but you're choosing a black person
right.
to focus on. That's why that argument is so trash. And then again, like you did lob it up to me, they didn't survive for the same reason, and then they didn't stay till graduation. The yield was so low for the same reason why a lot of black kids were referred to special ed once there was integration. See, a lot of people don't do their homework. It's like special education, or what they call IEP, that came about post integration. Prior to integration, that didn't exist. They didn't have special education. So a lot of people, a lot of black and brown people, copper people, they don't make it because they don't get the support. It's almost like being petty. Oh, so you want to go to school with us, and you think, okay, we're going to make it harder for you. We're not going to give you the same supports. We're not going to accommodate you. We're not going to compensate you. You know what I mean? So that's the thing when we look at this, you know, through a microscope, you know. But I don't want to always, because it's not balanced. I don't want to always say, oh man, you know, it's all pros. Like, you know what I'm saying? We just get into any institution, you know, based on race, and that'll be the determining factor. What are some of the pros and cons? What are some of the cons of affirmative action? Other than it has a low yield of, like, you know, black people, you know, actually finishing a degree once they do get accepted. What are some other cons?
Well, I'm going to take the low-hanging fruit that everybody's aware of, but I'm going to put it in a context they may not have heard of yet. So I'm biracial. My mom's family is from Italy. So I have a cousin who works or worked at one point for Turner Construction. You guys have seen Turner Construction. If you're in the city of Seattle, they do a lot of work there. So one day I sat down with my cousin because he asked me a question about the minority contracting rules that the city of Seattle had just came down with. And we were having a conversation. He said to me, well, you know, he was asking, like, putting this out there. He said, well, you know that none of the construction companies actually feel like they have to hire anybody that's black because they can just hire their wives. And I said, what? He said, right. So he said, all you'd have to do is have your wife start her own construction company, or at least have, you know, that LLC, and she can subcontract with whoever she wants. They can get the job. and it will count as a minority hire because they've contracted or subcontracted with a woman. And this is the way that these people can keep money in the communities that they want to keep it in, and do business with people they trust, as opposed to doing what the minority subcontractor law is designed to do, which is to expand the pot, and to expand the amount of people's businesses that actually have the opportunity to grow from government contracts. And this is not a new practice, but this is a practice that insiders know. And so this is the reason why people like Eddie Wright Jr., et cetera, in Seattle will talk about the Port of Seattle not fulfilling their contractual duty to have a certain percentage of minority contractors, even though on paper it looks like it. These are the games.
Yeah, because I know one of the trope stats that I used to come across, back when I was, debating in this heavenly, and I guess I'm gonna have to jump
Drop
back and
drop it.
I got to get back into the ring
You're back in the bag.
and which I don't like to do. I do it for people who want to learn a couple strategies and stuff, because the success of our communities and our families, the bottom line, Bobby, is not winning arguments. It's not unless it's wait. Let me go back. Not unless it's winning arguments in court, and that's going to have some kind of, you know what I'm saying, outcome beneficial to your community. But most of us don't have that opportunity to do that. You know what I'm saying? But one of the data tropes that came out during that time is that they were saying that, and I have to go research it, that the people that were benefiting the most from affirmative action were white women, based on that scenario that you gave.
Yeah.
And so let me get it. Let me get into my conspiracy theory bag.
There we go.
And every time I start this conspiracy theory bag rant, people start doing all this and that, but it really is really simple. It really is simple when you look at the prison industrial complex and how many people are going to prison as opposed to going to college. The wealth to income disparity between Black folks and white folks, and the conditions of our neighborhoods and our communities, the rate that Black people are dying in comparison to white folks, especially Black men. We're dying really a lot sooner than a lot of people in this world. We might be leading the league, and we're definitely one of the highest groups when it comes to suicide and depression. So when we put all those things together, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. If you talk about a medical apartheid or whatever, the disparities point to there is a conspiracy. There is a plan. There is a design plan to keep us behind. That's just a fact. That's the whole racism thing. That's white supremacy. That's institutional racism. That's reason why we have a conversation about affirmative action, because we have acknowledged there is a conspiracy to hold us back. Now, let me go a little bit deeper. When we talk about white supremacy, racism, and institutional racism, these institutions were established to develop and maintain the power of white men. Period. That's who's on our dollar. That's who were the slave masters. That's who were importing and exporting slaves. And, that's the people who said that women couldn't vote. This is about white male power. Throughout the years, that has been threatened. It's been compromised. So now, with the reparations discussion heating up, gaining some traction, having absolutely almost 100% validity, to the point where they're not even saying We can't give it to you. Now it's the question is how much? Because they, for the most part, they dropped the conversation of like, okay, but who should give it to you and how much? Because we know that this, you know what I'm saying, the South, you know what I'm saying, they got reparations. You know what I'm saying? When they took the enslaved black folks away from them. You know what I'm saying? It's like reparations is not a new thing, you know? So I'm really thinking this is a situation when we talk about abortions and things of that nature, is, and that plays into it, there is a genetic survival component of this whole thing. And there's a social genetic survival component of it. And the social genetic component is when we are allowing more people that look like me and you, not just that, into their institutions, but with a liberated mindset that can flip all their arguments upside down and say, this doesn't make sense. This is very archaic. This is outdated. And then they can call it CRT. And once they can name it and they can label it, then they can assign different laws to criminalize it. And what it's doing is the more that we're in their institutions and we have influence, then they become less and less powerful. And just like they can be bred out politically, philosophically, they can be bred out genetically. And that's and people were like, oh, so you're saying that there is a conspiracy because they don't want to be genetically annihilated, you know? Absolutely. Absolutely. There is a fear that black and brown people would genetically eliminate melanin deficient or white folks. That's not true logic. Then tell me reason why they have miscegenation laws. Why? Why do they have them? Why is Hitler's whole campaign of eugenics based around race and keeping a pure white race? I can't make this stuff up. I mean, I could, but I'm not. So this is deep. This is a conspiracy, and it's very important that we see what's happening, and that we got to ask ourselves this important question: is how do we level the playing field without certain
Mechanisms.
mechanisms? Exactly. Mechanism like affirmative action. That's my question to you.
Well, I think that the nonprofit space, and sometimes it's going to be even doing things that we used to do. So, for example, if you're saying that we're going to move to this meritocracy model that doesn't take into consideration the playing field being unlevel, then as a community, we have to create certain kinds of opportunities for young people that they would have gotten or that they wouldn't have had to have if affirmative action existed. And so, just this might sound too loosey goosey, but basically, what I'm saying is if an application before, and this is the example that I'm using with people, example 4 would be you applying and you say, I interned with my uncle who is a mechanic. That's my internship. But if you're competing against a person who was an intern for the symphony, for example, those are signs of class and probably signs of race ultimately. But somebody out there on the admissions committee would say objectively that the symphony is more valuable. And we know that because how many people who have an uncle that's a mechanic are sitting on the admissions board, right? So we have to do something as a community to create those symphony opportunities for people. And we used to do that through our churches. Not because I want to go to church, but because those were institutions that had the ability to connect people. And that ultimately, that networking piece is just going to become more important because you're not going to be able to rely on people in your same social standing. If you want those opportunities, you have to elevate. But what used to bring people together were these faith communities where people across the social spectrum would be in the same space.
And fraternities and sororities also.
Exactly, in the Divine Nine. So and when you talk about the negatives and positives, so yes, there's a negative, but on one hand, we're going to get back to our roots, because this is an opportunity for us to get back to this community building that I think we kind of maybe abandoned a little bit in the last 25 years. So I think that it's going to be incumbent on our communities and our organizations, our fraternities, our sororities, our churches, our Rotary clubs,
Sonic
these
order.
the Masonic Order, the the Prince Hill or the Prince Hall Masons, those groups need to figure out ways to offer things that look like elite opportunities for young people that can compete with the opportunities that our peers who are less melanin oriented will have. And because ultimately, the reason why the Harvard case is so frustrating with the poverty Olympics is because what this group of students who just so happen to be Chinese Americans and what their parents are saying is that they have graduated from the necessity of affirmative action to compete with their white peers, so nobody else needs it. Or they don't care if anybody else needs it. But what we know based on income just in King County, and I don't know the Pierce County statistics, but I know that in 2020, the household income gap was like $40,000 between Black Americans and white Americans. And $40,000 to me sounds like the disposable income gap is probably even larger than that. And the disposable income gap is what you utilize to offer your children opportunities outside of school. So if we are going to have less opportunities just in King County than all the other groups, we have to do something collectively. We have to pool our resources to close the gap so that we can have those opportunities for our children so they can compete, unless we're going to change it overnight. But I'm here to tell you it's not going to happen.
And I don't want to go down a deep rabbit hole and debate it because we're not going to have an answer and a resolution. I feel like when we talk about a lot of these organizations and institutions in our own community, because people call me a hardhead and they could say I'm difficult. I experienced this. I feel like we need affirmative action. How do we, even for those elite Black organizations? That was one of the biggest conflicts between like W. Du Bois and Booker T.
Washington,
or W.E. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey. Aside from W. Du Bois calling Marcus Garvey an ape, I think that he was unapologetically the talented 10th.
He was.
Unapologetically. And that had a color code to it also. It wasn't just based on a meritocracy. There was colorism that played a part in that.
Sure.
I mean, whether you're talking about the brown paper bag test, blah, 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 it existed. So what do we do when we feel like we need affirmative action even to get into fraternities and sororities, Masonic orders, Black student unions, Nation of Gods and Earths, NOI, all these institutions and organizations have an admission criteria.
Mm-hmm.
You cannot go into the Nation of Islam looking like me. I have too much facial hair.
Mm-hmm.
I do.
I've never tried. I don't know. But
yeah. I mean, so how do we avoid the same criteria obstacles that we have with the dominant, group? How do we avoid that happening in our own communities?
Man, that's a good question, because I know for a fact that your criminal record could be a disqualifier for joining Alpha right off the bat.
I did not know that.
Absolutely.
You
got to pass a background test. And
I did not know that you'd be disqualified. I did not know that.
Absolutely.
They were trying to recruit me, and that wouldn't have disqualified me. I'm not
I don't
trying to
know,
two shoes or anything like that.
but
Um,
but
yeah.
it's to your point
Mhm.
that there's certain standards for all of these organizations that have to be met that will disqualify some of the people we're talking about in this conversation that we're having, that we know will have trouble competing
Right.
against everybody on a level playing field. And so then your question is, well, how can we as a community save those people if we have those same kinds of standards internally? And it's hard for me to answer that question for the simple fact that I hate that we're not allowed essentially
I've seen it.
to have elite institutions,
Yeah.
because those are the things that we use to compete externally as well. So you don't want to use words like dilute, right? Because that has a connotation. However, that is exactly what the perception is when you talk about something that the American Bar Association did, where they are changing the standards for LSAT scores, and like a bunch of law schools popped up that are not certified law schools. So when you go to one of these law schools, um, for one, it's arguable whether you can take the bar in every state. But two, let's just say that you did. Let's just say that you could take the bar and you passed it. When you go to apply to for a job, you're signaling that you maybe shouldn't have been able to ever reach this point, and that's going to be something that people are aware of. So if you open the gate to such an extent that there's no standards for anything, then nothing has external value, so it becomes a challenge. But I think that there's a way for you to be more inclusive without making it so that there's no standards. And I think that the answer is going to be in having a coming to Jesus, so to speak, or Allah, or whatever you want to call it, or whoever you want to call it, and saying, what can we do to be more inclusive uh, to people who are being essentially displaced and alienated by this affirmative action ruling? Because maybe the answer is to say, in Alpha, maybe you change the criminal background check and you say, well, no violent felonies, no crimes of dishonesty. And then, if somebody has a PCS, so possession of a controlled substance, you say that's not something we would disqualify for. Those are the kinds of things that I would be suggesting, because you need to move it. You need to be more realistic. You need to be more understanding of the circumstances that people come from, if this is going to be the route that they use to compete and you really truly do want to do a service for everybody.
Or that's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is there can be a redemption, a system of redemption. So if you have a criminal record, can this organization that I want to be a part of provide me with a system that will allow me to redeem myself?
That sounds like probation.
That's fair though. I think Nation of Islam does that to a certain degree. Okay. We looking at your, we gonna look at your diet, brother, sister.
This brother is
I know.
starving.
Huh?
Oh, I just remembered. What did the prophet do? He ate.
So it's like, um, I don't want it to seem like we can't have standards, you know, because I feel like if we go back to the root, right? I always do this. My reference is always African or African spiritual systems. There always was an initiation. You just couldn't just pop up. Not in the elite organizations. If you wanted to be a griot or a jolly, you had to go through an initiation, a system of initiation. There's nothing wrong with that. But you weren't necessarily just, of course, there's exceptions, just disqualified, based on your past
Sure.
and the mistakes you made, especially if the mistakes you made were based on
The conditions.
living, huh?
On the conditions?
On the conditions that were racist, that were meant for you to self-sabotage, that were circumstantial. I'm sure you talk about. I mean, of course. I mean, that's a lob right there. You talk about that a lot in court.
Always.
Circumstantial. That's circumstantial. And I had to deal with that when I worked with the state with CPS as a family preservation therapist. My job was to go into the household and change the circumstances because it was a high likelihood that they would not behave and make the same decisions if their circumstances were different. And sometimes it just came with education. Like we'd have families that came from different countries, like for instance, East Africa, where it was cool to just pick up whatever was close to you and put it up against somebody, a child, or even a woman, if they were not listening to you or not, following your words.
Tough.
Can't do that. You can't do that here. Well, you
No.
can, but you're going to have to deal with the consequences. So my job was to go in there and say, what else can you do? Conflict mediation. These are different strategies, you know what I'm saying, and change the circumstances that can change situations, you know. Um, I mean, we can do a part 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. I would love to have a bigger panel, uh, and talk about this, especially some people who have opposing viewpoints as us, because it gets real complicated. We're running up against an hour, so I want to close out. Always we always do what's the plan of action, but I want to give you a heads up. I've added another one. What's the homework?
Mm.
Give someone a little bit of homework to do. You know what I'm saying? If anyone has ever gone to a good therapist, when you sit there in that session, you're gonna sit in there for probably 30 minutes to an hour. But after that, if they're a really good, effective therapist, they're gonna give you some homework. Like
Mm-hmm.
this is what I want you to work on. But thinking about what we have talked about today and reflecting on it, what do you think the plan of action is?
Well, I think the plan of action has got to be just centered on paying attention and identifying the things that your children are elite at as early as possible, because developing these skills is going to be the thing that allows them to compete, at if they and maybe they want to go to Howard instead of Stanford. Maybe that's what they want to do, and that's fine. But if you want to have Stanford as an option, then you need to identify the things that they're truly special at as early as possible. And I'm not saying that you only do that. I'm not suggesting that, but you want to develop those things, because what we're up against now is a scenario where we're competing against people with substantially more resources most of the time. And those are going to be people who are going to have resumes that reflect their life experience and their parents' careers. So the way that you compete with that is by being outstanding at something, and saying, I bring this specific skill to campus, I bring this specific skill to your institution, there's nobody else like me in this particular respect, or I'm one of the best in this respect. And it doesn't have to be a hard skill. Logic and I talk about how is leadership is a skill that you can be a lead in. Leadership is a skill that you can market. Social networking, being able to bring people together. These are all gifts that people have, and you can become a lead at them, but they need to be trained. So identify those things in your children, and bring them up with as much confidence as you can, and explain to them that the world has just gotten that much more competitive, and the only way to respond to it for us now in the short run is to do everything that we can to make the best versions of ourselves.
And keeping that idea in mind, what would be a piece of homework? Like, how can you start today or tomorrow with what you just now said?
Well, I think the homework, actually, I'm going to go a different route. I think the homework is for people to kind of understand what happened with the court. So you don't need to be a lawyer, but I think that it would serve everybody to understand what happened and why it happened. So if you can listen to the oral arguments, there's oyez.org. Oh yeah, you can literally listen to the oral arguments that the attorneys made on there. If you look up this Harvard, I don't remember the plaintiff's names. I think it's like CCA or something like that. But if you look it up, you can listen to the oral arguments, and you'll learn something about what's happening in our country right now with respect to race. Because the thing that you're going to hear from the pundits and the thing that you're going to hear over and over and over from this case, the tagline is colorblind. The tagline is colorblind.
It sounds like a lot of traffic violations. Sound like you're running a lot of
So,
red lights.
so you like understand that where we're headed right now and the court's opinion of where this country is at is that remedial measures are no longer necessary because we live in a colorblind society. Regardless of whether you believe that's true, you need to understand it.
Okay, thanks for that. My plan of action. Um, my plan of action is whether you are have used affirmative action in the past, or you need some kind of accommodation or some kind of compensation to make it, because that's just we see it as simple as handicap access. They get to park closer to Walmart entrances and exits because they have a handicap. So you're going to have compensations that you're going to need throughout life. That's just how most of our lives end up. But you got to have a plan. You got to have a plan of action. I know that sounds corny because I'm using the word, what I'm saying, in my plan of action. So, but you just got to have a plan. You got to have a plan, and you got to teach that to your children and the people in your community. Like, no matter what is your plan? And then you have to have like Bobby said, you have to have a strong desire to learn. So that goes hand in hand. You have a strong desire to learn, which can go in to the ingredients of your plan, and it fortifies your plan. So my homework is for you would be to write down, what is your plan? You're like, I don't, what are you talking about? Whatever you want to be successful at. It could be anything. It could be a workout routine. Well, write it down. Write it down. And and write down how it looks on a day by day basis. Create a routine for yourself to be successful and be successful in whatever you want to do. So that will be my plan of action, and that will be my homework. Your homework for tomorrow is to, write down something you want to, be successful at, and write a plan for it. And then learn more about it. If you, as simple as you want to work out, well, find out where you're going to work out. Write it down. But also find out at least 2 or 3 workout routines and what is actually happening inside and outside of your body when you're working out. You know what I'm saying? So, that's basically, what I'm saying, my plan of action and my homework. I'm sure we're going to come up against, some more conversations around this and what's happening, like what's next, because we can't really, capture it all in 58 minutes, which we attempted to do. But I think we gave we dropped some breadcrumbs for people to follow, some Easter eggs or whatnot. And you can you go from there. So anyways, go ahead, Bobby. Oh, you're muted. You're muted.
Last thing is also the court refused President Biden's loan forgiveness. So at the same time that it's harder to get in now, you got to pay for what you earned already. So be aware of that. That's also next for everybody. We got to pay these bills.
Yep. Oh yeah, pay these bills. Great segue. Hey, you can always donate to Cash App, Logic Man, $ Logic Man, and Venmo at Logic Man, because Bobby and I definitely take out time of our days to do these and whatnot. Make sure you're commenting, you know what I'm saying? And if you want to be on C Talk, I'm gonna get my Dr. Umar on. If you want to be on C Talk, if you want to be on C Talk, stuff to make your seeds walk, make sure that you're DM me and let me know. DM Bobby. No, and give us some topic ideas too of what you want us to cover, and whatnot, because this is all about the community. We out. We'll see you next time. Peace, 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 peace.